Great. Okay, let's get started. Hello all. Thank you for coming to Fathom Hell or Soar Angelic, the risks and rewards of psychedelics. We're joined by three fantastic speakers who are going to talk about the possible risks as well as possible harm reduction strategies around psychedelics use from a number of different angles. We've got with us Ed Prideaux, who is a journalist, MSc student in psychology, and operations lead at the Perception Restoration Foundation, which researches and looks into harm reduction practices around HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. We're also joined by Joe Welker,
nice to meet you.
Who's a Presbyterian ministerial candidate at Harvard Divinity and author of the newsletter Psychedelic Candor, who's written about sort of spiritual outcomes and spiritual risks related to psychedelic use. And finally, we're joined by Tehseen Norani, who's an honorary fellow at Durham University in their Department of Anthropology, whose research focuses on extreme experiences, including psychedelic and psychotic states. So just the structure of the event, we'll have about 30 minutes of some introductory remarks, 30 minutes of discussion between the speakers, and then we'll move over to Q&A from the audience the last half an hour. So with that, I'd like to start by asking Joe a little bit about what HPPD is, how it might be caused, and any kind of harm reduction strategies surrounding it.
I assume you meant to say Ed. Joe is the ministerial candidate. No worries. Both one-syllable names. So the question was, what is HPPD and what my work is around? Okay. Yeah. So HPPD is a diagnosis found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, that stands for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. And hallucinogen persisting perception disorder is, in the broadest terms possible, a condition in which one develops long-lasting perceptual aberrations, often called distortions or disturbances, long after a trip has ended, and in ways that cause distress and impairment. And HPPD is somewhat mysterious as a condition, because in the DSM-5 and for many decades, this condition was thought to be one of a continual chronic re-experiencing of the visual phenomena associated with the psychedelic state. So it literally was a persisting perception disorder of hallucinogens, but we've come to learn that HPPD actually encompasses a broader range of perceptual aberrations that aren't necessarily exclusive to psychedelic states. So, for example, what might some of the main visual symptoms of HPPD be? So I myself have lived with symptoms associated with HPPD for about 7 years since a misadventure with LSD when I was 17. And the main symptoms I've had for these 7 years have been visual static, an overlay of grayish particles over my field of vision and over surfaces. After images, you look at an object and you look away, and there might be a neon bluish or greenish replication of an object elsewhere when you look away. Trails, streaking, traces, geometric patterns, melting walls, other illusions of movement, objects breathing, just as one might have while under the influence of psychedelics, halos around objects, halos around lights, sometimes actual flashback-esque style experiences where the HPPD would present, rather than being a chronic condition, it would present in these acute transient episodes. So I recall one particular instance in a job interview where I was being asked a question about content marketing, and then before I knew it, I was flung back in my chair, and the woman interviewing me was suddenly bordered by lightning bolts, streaks of gold, fantastic kaleidoscopes. Somehow I was still able to get the job, and then navigating that office environment whilst in a weird way still sort of tripping in a weird way was certainly interesting. But HPPD is surprisingly common viewed in broad terms, or at least some kind of post-psychedelic visual phenomena it seems to be relatively common. So the last prevalent study we had was from 2011, and that was done by Matthew Baggett. and colleagues at Erowid, and they surveyed 2,500 people on the website and found that just over 60% reported a long-lasting visual change after a psychedelic experience or a series of psychedelic experiences. And then 1 in 25 of this total sample, 4.2%, reported a complex of visual changes that were so distressing that they were considering going to a doctor. And this is suggestive of this diagnosis of HPPD. But the funny thing is that we used to think that HPPD was exclusive to hallucinogens, and especially with this idea that it was a re-experiencing effect. But especially once you zoom out and consider it's just a perceptual condition triggered by hallucinogens, we started to realize that similar perceptual changes can be triggered by non-hallucinogenic drugs or non-psychedelic drugs. So we found out that MDMA could cause this perceptual condition, actually fairly effectively. We found out that cannabis could cause this perceptual condition. In fact, MDMA and cannabis actually seem to be comparable to the powers of LSD and psilocybin in triggering HPPD. And then more reports and more experiences began filtering in about SSRIs triggering this condition. And so we don't actually know the extent to which HPPD is hallucinogen specific. We don't know if HPPD is perhaps where there might be different subtypes of HPPD specific to the drug. So it seems plausible to me that an HPPD case triggered by LSD might be somewhat more psychedelic than one triggered by an SSRI, for instance. I imagine they're not going to see flashes of lightning bolts and geometric patterns. But what is interesting, kind of to finish off this thought, is that we need to sort of decouple even classically psychedelic phenomena from psychedelic drugs. Like psychedelic drugs only trigger these, the paisley shapes and the geometric phenomena because they're acting on a pre-existing wiring in the brain. So, for instance, I hear from people occasionally who have seen geometric patterns their entire lives. They've essentially had HPPD without ever having consumed a drug, so to speak. And I know of a friend whose girlfriend regularly sees flashes of color and geometric patterns. So HPPD really speaks to a fascinating tendency that perhaps can be catalyzed by the psychedelic experience to non-ordinary perceptual experience. And my research is attempting to understand what makes people distressed with these visual symptoms, which they aren't necessarily. Some people are really able to roll with it and either find it non-distressing or actually perhaps enjoyable. Some people view it as a free trip. Other people, they might be distressed for a time and then accept it. But then other people, perhaps because of the actual intensity of the visuals or because they simply don't like them and they want them to stop and they will not stopping and they did not expect this at all, because HPPD has been dismissed as a possibility for a long time, find themselves with their lives in ruins, in tatters, especially when the symptoms are very intense. I mean, hanging out in HPPD communities online, you hear of true horror stories. One famous case on the forums is this guy who took LSD at Glastonbury in 1995, and ever since then has had a strobing effect in his vision to the tune of around 8 or 9 flashes a second. And he's now in his 40s. It's still going, still constant geometric patterns, still constant illusions of movement, and a dissociative effect that's quite common with HPPD. And we don't know how common that extreme, let's say, more neurological HPPD instance is. But I think that the researcher, maybe we may work out what the real prevalence distribution is for the more extreme cases of HPPD.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Would you mind just saying a little bit about what the potential causes or risk factors around HPPD are?
Sure. So as I said, it's interesting to talk about causes because, well, first of all, this is a whole diagnosis structure around hallucinogens, and maybe it's not even hallucinogen specific. The HPPD diagnosis was oriented essentially around LSD, because LSD was by far the most popular recreational psychedelic of the 20th century, and HPPD was formulated in the early 1980s, essentially, based on LSD patients. But in terms of zooming in on the causes, for example, neurophysiologically, Well, the primary hypothesis is known as the disinhibition hypothesis. Essentially, that HPPD is a condition of psychedelic-induced decoupling of the filters of visual perception. That phenomena like visual static and after images are ones that even normal people who have never taken drugs might get occasionally, but this kind of visual noise, so to speak, is stuff that the visual system might tend to filter out. But the psychedelic drug, perhaps because of its effects on neuroplasticity, I'm not an expert on neurophysiology or neuroplasticity, but the idea is that your perceptual centers become more malleable, and for whatever reason they do not reset to how they were before. And in certain ways, when we talk about for example, the emotional affective changes, what people get with psychedelics, people attribute it to neuroplasticity. You think in different ways, you feel in different ways, your depression's been lifted, and an equal neuroplastic induced lasting change can happen also in the perceptual field. People might report more mildly that colors now seem brighter, colors now seem sharper, and this was something that was reported even by the American writer Havelock Ellis in 1898, reporting on the effects of mescaline. He noticed that colors were sharper now. And so if you just zoom along this continuum a bit, you see that some kind of lasting, let's say, neuroplastic visual phenomenon is maybe not unthinkable. Is there a correlation between the dose of psychedelic taken and the risk of developing HPPD? Rebecca has said in the chat. And what's really interesting is that there is no consistent relationship between the number of trips or the number of hallucinogen exposures, as various scientific writers would put it in the 20th century, and developing HPPD. Although, these writers in the 20th century especially noticed that they would have people coming in who had taken acid, 3-4 times and developed a condition equally as strong as someone who had taken it 400 times, or some people would have taken it 100 times and they never had anything like this. And that led Henry Abraham, who was the psychiatrist and researcher who developed the HPPD diagnosis, to suspect that there was a genetic basis for the condition, a genetic vulnerability, which he supposed actually to be structured in 4 main groups. So the one group, people who would never get it; one group that would get it after, let's say, a small number of doses; a third, a medium, moderate number of doses; and the fourth, a large to massive number of exposures. But this has never really been particularly followed up with much in the way of research, but I suppose it's interesting. There have been associations between developing HPPD and the nature of the psychedelic experience. Although it depends really what we mean by HPPD, because writers in the 60s and 70s were more interested in flashbacks, which are different to HPPD in subtle ways. And HPPD is this chronic condition. Day to day, your actual visual perception is different, whereas flashbacks were these periodic re-experiences, and authors related flashbacks to a number of different things, especially transient anxiety, perhaps after a challenging psychedelic experience, or a traumatic psychedelic experience. And that even applies to the chronic HPPD condition. People have noticed a correlation between highly distressing psychedelic trips and then something just doesn't go back to as before. And that was certainly the case for me. And just as an early indication of the data I've gathered for my dissertation, it does seem that a lot of people in my survey that I've done, I had about 200 respondents, had extremely distressing psychedelic experiences, but then some people's were completely fine, great, and then the next day something had changed and it still hasn't gone back to normal.
Thank you. Jumping to the sort of slightly different topic, Joe, would you mind saying something about spiritual risks surrounding psychedelic use, or how psychedelic use might have adverse impacts on spiritual beliefs and practices?
Sure, Sam. Thank you for having me. And I do feel like I need to, as part of these spiritual risks, because they often come in the context of social dynamics. There are some greater social risks that I think, some of which are not necessarily unique to psychedelics, but might be at a heightened risk or heightened prevalence. And I'm going to have to unfortunately brush through these faster than each topic deserves. But you have things like sexual abuse, which was reported on widely last year by Symposia, the psychedelic journalist outlet, in the high-profile MAPS clinical trial. But there's really happens a lot more prominently than that. And so this kind of thing, there's a lot of factors that go into that. In general, I think a lot of these issues come from psychedelic communities, which may be getting more conscious around this. I'm not really super encouraged, but in terms of being poorly informed around boundaries, poorly informed around ethics, not really thinking consciously through ethics. A lot of ethical rules from existing institutions of various forms come about because of institutional memory. There's often there's a saying like every rule has a story behind it. Well, if you're young, still figuring out, if you don't have much of a history behind you, it may not make sense why there are certain ethical rules or ethical norms from other spiritual institutions and so on. There's issues of financial abuse, which can go from the more acute, such as we saw with, as Olivia Goldhill reported on last year, in the case of a Holocaust survivor, who was an elder who was given MDMA over the course of, they developed an improper relationship with a MAPS board member. This is all alleged in her reporting. You can check out more specifics on that. But I think there's a broader culture of financial abuse where anybody in psychedelic capitalism really doesn't have a financial incentive to fully inform you about risks. I mean, if you think about it, there's actually an incentive to undersell potential risks because it's bad for marketing. I'd say there's another general risk of what you might call the cultivation of inappropriate relationships, power imbalances that can develop over time. So you have therapists, researchers, spiritual leaders building inappropriate relationships with their clients, with their patients, et cetera, which then can become psychological abuse or sexual abuse or financial abuse. It kind of flows downstream of that. There's a lot of what I've experienced in my own feeling, a lot of sort of, the word cult is a charged word. It's a heavy word, and it's not used so much in academic religious studies anymore. But there are cult-like dynamics, and it's tricky because no cult in history has ever been like, hey guys, we're a cult. There's a lot more subtle things that happen over time, and there's a lot behind that. Again, I feel a little conflicted that I don't have time to get into all these, but in general, I feel the bigger picture informing all these spiritual risks and these social risks is there's just a lack of informed consent all around, because I think the education is just so poor all around, and there's a lot of there's a lot of issues in science broadly speaking that have nothing to do with psychedelics specifically, whether it's the grant process, whether it's academia dynamics, whether it's the peer review process, which is broken. Now you add in a factor of a lot of psychedelic researchers being really driven by a sort of whether you want to call it a messianic complex or a big spiritual belief that psychedelics are going to save the world, heal humanity, spiritualize humanity, the words of Rick Doblin, or what have you. So you have that element of thing where I just personally don't trust a lot of the science. I think there's a lot more skepticism that's needed. And unfortunately, though, it gets pushed out by what is a kind of a counter-propaganda psychedelic press in the context of arguably 50 years of drug war propaganda, which were, say, anti-drug propaganda. A lot of why we're here is a result of conscious strategic decisions to create counter narratives. And that's done through a lot of selective choices along the way of what information to share or not, what information people deem is not acceptable for you to hear. Like for Ed, as far as Ed's work goes, HPPD was almost like saying Lord Voldemort, to use that old phrase. It was almost hard for people to even speak of, much less these other things I'm talking about, because you don't want to give them the bad idea of the research in such a fragile state. people aren't gonna, it'll get misused by our opponents and things like that. So that's the sort of broader climate, which I feel. As far as I would say personal spiritual risks go, I'm gonna use some Christian language a little bit. I am a Christian, but I think even if you're not a Christian, I think other religions have ways of addressing similar problems. I'm just not going to be able to translate that work into Buddhist terms or Hindu terms. And I also don't want to pretend like I speak on behalf of all Christians either. I'm from a Presbyterian tradition. I'm influenced by Catholics, by Orthodox, by a lot of other different types of Christians, but this is just my take on this. And a root sin at the core of a lot of Christianity, a root problem, is the problem of idolatry. And there's a cartoon version in our heads of what idolatry looks like, which is like literally worshiping something called another god, literally called a different god. But there's a lot more subtle ideas around what idolatry means. And one term I like and have heard a lot before is worshiping the good at the expense of the whole. So like you don't idolize bad things, right? You wouldn't idolize obviously terrible things. You idolize often good things, but in doing so, you might overlook the harm, or you might miss what's actually sacred. And this kind of goes back to this Zen phrase of, Zen is supposed to be a finger pointing to the moon. You don't worship the finger, you look for the moon. There is a history that I need to acknowledge around the idea of idolatry that has this sort of cultural genocidal colonization terms, and I'm not advocating for anything like that. I'm pro-religious freedom. I do strongly diverge from most ayahuasca churches, even though I've worked with them before. And I did a lot of work, personal work with ayahuasca churches. And I think one issue that I think about idolatry and psychedelics a lot is creating an image of God or an image of the divine that's psychedelic shaped. In terms of it, God starts, your idea of what God must be like, what the sacred must be like, is really highly correlated to your own personal experience, which isn't to say your personal experience is irrelevant, but in my tradition, my beliefs, that God is bigger than our personal experience. God is bigger than experience itself. And so there's this version of idolatry that Catholic monk Thomas Merton talked about, which is called illuminism, which is the idolatry of experience itself. And Merton was a Christian mystic as part of this tradition, whether you want to call it the apophatic tradition, that really tried to focus on focusing too much on your subjective personal experience leads to ideas around God that essentially are no different than things like white nationalist Christianity, right? Where, well, all the people I love are white and Christian, and so God must love white Christians. God must be a white Christian. So that's another kind of version of that. And I think what's interesting is that what's been lost is that even Ram Dass would talk about this in his own way in the 70s, Richard Alpert, where eventually he stopped regularly taking psychedelics, and he would talk about how he would always come back down from his LSD experience, and that the goal is really to move past the method. But that can be really hard with psychedelics. It can take a long time because the experiences are so captivating, are so powerful, beautiful, meaningful. And so it's something that I certainly fell into and was kind of hard for me to process and move past. And so if you have this sort of psychedelic shaped idea of God, of the mystical experience being the core of all, the universal core of all religion, of God itself, well, I think that's a problem that leads to things like messianic complex around psychedelics, that psychedelics will save humanity, that the future of religion is just going to be a bunch of people taking psychedelics forever and living in world harmony. Doblin's strategy has essentially been to combat fundamentalism. And so the idea is that we're going to give conservatives the true idea of God by dosing them and making them become mystics, as if conservatives were not spiritual in their own way, or as if they didn't take psychedelics already in some cases. And so that's one. There's another issue of ego inflation and pride, which is another sort of root problem of that leads to a lot of different other problems. There's a sense in which we've talked about ego death and all that kind of thing. It's almost a passé observation now that people joke about, well, psychedelics are supposed to kill your ego, but then why do I see so many other big egos in the psychedelic world? I think most of us have seen that or felt that at some point. And what's interesting, what started challenging my thinking around this or made me question it was when Aldous Huxley wrote Thomas Merton in the late 50s, talking about this very thing. Merton kind of suggested it might be a dangerous illusion that's happening where you think, well, I've transcended my ego, but you're really expanding what your sense of what belongs as part of your subjective egoic self. And so there's a lot around that really needs to be closer examined. Finally, there's two more things I want to talk about. Chris Hedges is a longtime war correspondent and journalist, a leftist writer as well. And he wrote his kind of most famous work is a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, talking about the seductive nature of being in literal war zones. And I don't want to oversell it. Obviously, we're not in a literal war zone in terms of violence, but we kind of are. I mean, this is a drug war that is a force that gives us meaning. And I felt that whether I was in it or starting to try to be a little bit more distanced and thinking about it slightly differently, there's a seduction of being involved in something big and meaningful. There's this mythologizing, this romanticism around it. And with the things that he was talking about, the sort of seduction of being involved in reporting on war and being in war, it reminded me of being around this field, which is like the fascination with the grotesque and the weird, the sort of hypersexuality and the hedonism, the sort of projection of meaning, beauty, power, and magic onto people, the breakdown of normal moral boundaries, the idea that lots of people become an accomplice, the sort of hijacking and recovery of memory that he talks about, where bad stories are memory hold, bad history is just completely forgotten. It's not amplified because it's bad for the movement. It's bad for the narrative. The counter propaganda press doesn't report on it or repeat it. And some people just honestly don't know a lot of these stories because of that. And so finally, the last spiritual risk I want to mention here, something that I've been processing and still am wrapping my head around, which is this idea of moral injury. Now, some people have talked about moral injury with actually where psychedelics can help heal moral injuries from, let's say, veterans returning from war, because that's how the term moral injury was first originally studied in that context. And so I think it does have real promise. Psychedelics do have promise to heal moral injuries, but I also think an over fascination with psychedelics and working in this field can lead to moral injuries caused by psychedelics, where and the idea of moral injury happens when essentially when you witness, participate in, or are party to something that violates your deeply held beliefs about in your sense of right and wrong. And over time, like Vietnam War veterans, this sort of eroded your ability to judge what was right and wrong. And then after the fact, upon recollection, you realize now that the Vietnam War is not glamorized as it was among soldiers at the time, and now that there's not the feeling that we defeated capitalism or we defeated communism, they started wondering, well, what did I get signed up for? What was I used for, and who was using me? And so you had a lot of veterans dealing with that. And I think a lot of people, at least one person working in this industry that feels a moral injury of the sort of code of silence around a lot of these issues, about being enculturated into this narrative crafting and ignoring these problems. There's a sort of professionalization that happened in psychedelics and respectability politics that just lets these problems stay active, and realizing that maybe at one point in your own recreational use, you might have risked other people's lives, or you might have caused somebody to have legal problems or other psychological problems, things that you might feel terrible about. in retrospect. And so I think there's a lot of there's there that I need to still continue uncover and study and figure out more. Where what happens when the thing that you think is this incredible moral good that's going to save the world, but then you happen to know people that have been harmed by it. Well, the first thing a lot of people do with our cognitive dissonance is to ignore it and to not think about it. And that you can get away with that for a while, but if you start really sitting with people that have been harmed, it can be hard. It can be really hard, to say the least. And so I'll end my section at that.
Thank you very much. I think just bouncing off some of the ideas that I'd like to ask Tehseen, how do you think we can create healthier communities and cultures in the psychedelic community and in psychedelic research, given how sort of overwhelmingly positive people's experiences to psychedelics can be, and how that can impact their moral compass or kind of how they interact with the wider community?
That's for you, Joe, right?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, I was just saying that's for you, Joe, right? I think.
Oh, I was actually asking you, Tehseen. Sorry.
Are you asking me? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Hi. Well, hi. Let me just first say hi, if that's all right. But I'll try and segue into that. Sorry. Okay. It's really nice to be here. Nice to sort of see you all. Looking forward to hearing from you all a bit later. I'm always a big fan of dialogue and discussion, so it's going to be nice to get that going a bit later. And nice to thanks for your intros, Ed and Joe. I now do more. Most of my focus is actually around methodology and scientific methods, but also social scientific and other kinds of kind of disciplinary methods for how we know psychedelics. And I facilitate a group that kind of looks at that, and that's more my focus. But a quick run through sort of my biography in a way. I did a PhD in kind of sociology. It was actually in socio-legal studies, so sociology and law intersection, that was looking at the Hearing Voices movement, which some of you may know of, but within the psychiatric survivor and kind of mad justice intersections worlds. It's a kind of movement of folks who it's a kind of peer support movement of folks who all hear voices or something similar to that, but many of whom would reject a psychiatric diagnostic framing of what's happening to them as like a psychotic disorder or something like that, and instead sort of try and make meaning out of their voices together through peer support. So I came to the psychedelics world through quite a deep kind of engagement with and alliance with psychiatric survivors and discourses that problematize a very biomedical framing of extreme experiences and a pathologizing framing. And then I, about 10 years ago, I did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, which is a kind of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, psychedelic research centers now. And I was a psychedelic researcher for a couple of years, but doing kind of qualitative research into people who had, it was a pilot trial for people quitting smoking using psilocybin, and it was looking at their perceived mechanisms of change as to how they quit smoking or didn't quit smoking, and try and understand that a bit better. And it was during that time that I really came to think that not only the phenomenology of the experiences of people I had encountered and written about during my PhD, in the sort of madness world, and in particular people who hear voices, and psychedelic, and people having psychedelic experiences. Not only is the phenomenology sort of very overlapping in lots of interesting ways, but also how we can help and be with people who are having these extreme experiences when they're distressed, seem to have lots of overlaps. So for me, so I've been thinking about this kind of intersection of psychedelics and psychosis since about then, for about 8 years or so. And we organized a conference in 2021 called Psychedelics, Madness and Awakening, Harm Reduction and Future Visions. So that will speak to some extent to your question, Sam. And I just put the link in the chat if people are interested. It's all archived and available online, and accessible with like transcripts and stuff. And at the same time as kind of doing that work, I've been writing a bit on medicalization. So medicalization of psychedelics, and again, coming back to your question, Sam, part of that is like the massive increase in the hype around psychedelics as panaceas and so on, and the kind of problems with that. So your question is like how to create healthier communities around psychedelics. I mean, perhaps I can organize my thoughts in a few different ways. Like one would be picking up on some stuff that I think Joe was saying. Within the scientific kind of world, there's more and more of an interest, a kind of marginal interest in suggestibility as a kind of mechanism by which assisted psychotherapy works. So this speaks to kind of questions around kind of cults and power dynamics and abuse. But it also, one can go to Stan Grof's, this kind of infamous or famous kind of line of psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers of awareness. And if they're non-specific amplifiers, then it's kind of what they're amplifying is essentially kind of contextual to their own action. So actually, interestingly, someone who's part of Symposium, Nishay Devanau, some of you may know her, a humanities researcher, she just lead authored an article where she took the data, including my qualitative paper, from this Hopkins study of people quitting smoking or trying to quit smoking through psilocybin sessions and some psychotherapy. And she sort of analyzed the background, what got backgrounded in the write-up of that paper, of the other papers around that, of the press around that, which was the psychotherapy, the particular languaging that was used around how people should quit smoking, that was all kind of priming them before they then had their psilocybin sessions. And the argument of that paper, and I'm a sort of minor co-author on the paper, but the argument of it is that you can understand why people quit smoking, like in large, or to some extent at least, through the framework of suggestibility. So suggestibility is kind of one thing I would mention as an example of how some of these more some of these discourses that are pushed to the sidelines, these marginalized discourses, bringing them more to the fore, being more aware that there's not just one dominant explanation for how psychedelics work or whatever, is really important. So another way of thinking about healthier communities might be, I mean, for me, one thing that's been really interesting has been thinking about psychedelic experiences and the resurgence of psychedelic experiences and the mainstreaming of them alongside how people are approaching quote unquote madness, psychotic experiences and so on. And there was certainly in relation to the latter that we've got a history of, for example, a kind of critical approaches to madness, anti-psychiatry movement as being really big in the 60s, roughly the same time as a kind of first wave of, or a lot of interest in psychedelics in the West. And at that time, there were a lot of conversations about things like, in the anti-psychiatry movement, around things like support networks, respites, asylums, safe spaces. I don't know if you can hear that. There's a lot going on here. I've got two little kids, and I think part of part of what has to happen, again, coming back to something Joe said, is an analysis of the sort of social dynamics that have changed, wherein which we don't, for better and for worse, have these big mental hospitals nowadays. We don't have these big institutional spaces, which institutionalize people in ways that were really are horrible and abusive, and also provided collective spaces for resistance and dialogue and conversation. And the kind of collective spaces aspect of the way in which society has been increasingly structured since, the standard narratives would say in a kind of neoliberal era since the 1980s and so on, mean that there are fewer and fewer spaces in which people can feel safe and collectivize when they share harms that have happened to them, including through kind of the use of psychedelics or being involved in cults and so on. So that's a kind of another point. And then I'll probably just end by one last thing that kind of comes to mind in some of the conversations was, which I kind of thought I would bring it, I wanted to bring into the conversation, is a figure that I find quite useful for thinking about psychedelic experiences, psychotic experiences, extreme experiences that can end up being really distressing, is the trickster. And the trickster is a figure that I've written a little bit about, but in contrast to, especially through the kind of medicalizing imperatives within psychedelia right now and the kind of creation of an industry and a sector, there's a real desire to kind of recuperate all experience and make good, this kind of idea of like, there are no bad trips, there are only challenging experiences, and you need to work with them and you need to make them good. And then if you don't make them good, then maybe it's kind of on you, blah, blah, blah. So in contrast to that, I find like one line of thinking about psychedelic experiences through the trickster to be really helpful, which is to sort of say they're not, their experiences, maybe they're sort of, you could understand them as kind of fickle in a way, but they can turn on you, and they can turn on you for better and for worse. They can, the thing that seemed horrific, yes, can suddenly become the source of great insight, but vice versa too. And insight, people talk, there's a lot of emphasis on optics, which I find kind of interesting in the discussions around psychedelics, kind of insight, right? Being able to see, having visions and so on. But at the same time, there's a kind of, there's this concern that's been written about in relation to meditation too, of not being able to unsee what you've seen. There's also then that in itself is generative of fears of it. So, the kind of the fear of not being able to unsee what you've seen. So we're talking about kind of very charged kind of spirals of experience and then wondering about experience, a kind of this kind of looping processes in relation to these kinds of experiences, where when there is sense making in a more collective way, then that can enable people sometimes to kind of shut that down, or to land somewhere, or to be in a process of mutual inquiry with others. But when in a very hyper individualized context, it can end up spiraling kind of out of control. So I could talk more about the kind of trickster as a figure or an archetype, and that could be an interesting point of conversation to have, but maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Maybe then to open up the dialogue, if you're happy to talk about this, Ed, I'd be interested to hear what you think about the idea of the trickster in relation to perhaps your own bad trip or your own experiences of HPPD.
It's very interesting, the idea of seeing what can't be unseen. So I suppose that my own LSD experiences were, I suppose there's one particular LSD experience that kind of bridges together Joe and Tehseen's intros. So my psychedelic came of age in a time when the ego death had not yet been understood to be as silly as it probably is, when it still was the big thing everyone wanted. And I was very much influenced by a Timothy Learyan, or at least post-Learyan idea of, Tibetan Book of the Dead style, entering the void, ego dissolution. I think that's something else to as a quick point, is that so much of psychedelic harm, it seems, especially in the 60s, was from essentially a pseudo theology in which people were experiencing psychedelics. It was bad theology that led people to trip so often, and trip, at least in one sense, the wrong ways. And one of these was me. So I took LSD when I just turned 20, and had essentially what seemed like a profound ego dissolution experience. And I thought this was the experience I always wanted. And this was after I developed HPPD, mind you, because because despite having developed quite a profound condition, quite a profound aberration, let's say, from my psychedelic trips, I was drawn back to the well, which speaks to another risk that gets very much dismissed all the time, which is the risk of psychological addiction. You often see mentioned that psychedelics are not addictive, they're anti-addictive, and I think that actually often, or at least occasionally or frequently enough to not be trivial, they are addictive. But anyway, I went back to the acid bath, and I had this trip, and I thought it was the pivot upon which my life was going to change, but actually it triggered a full-blown dissociative disorder. I essentially within a year, with the accumulation of more chronic stress, I was re-entering this state of ego dissolution, and developed symptoms along the lines of depersonalization, derealization, which affects about 1/3 of people with HPPD. Essentially, a feeling of being completely and utterly separated from your body and the world around you. The world around you no longer feels real in any way. And I definitely resonate with a tricksterish element. I feel as if that psychedelic high was the idol that almost lied to me. And I don't want to get too grandiose, but I think that one of the biggest takeaways is that these psychological experiences of having a relaxed sense of ego are extremely powerful and are not to be taken lightly. And that's why an ever-escalating industry seeking to operationalize and commodify and make purely a good of extremely powerful psychospiritual experiences is just intrinsically concerning to me. And then secondly, that these experiences are not to be had, especially, or at least not speaking generally, had when you're young. Adolescents are the group about whom I'm probably most concerned. I was 17 when I developed HPPD. I'm seeing them, quite a few members of the Oxford Psychedelic Society have taken psychedelics, maybe took them in the first year of undergrad, or maybe took them towards the end of secondary school, maybe in the summer holidays afterwards. And there seems to be quite clear emerging evidence that psychedelic use in adolescence is associated with a broad range of mental health problems. And this might be purely correlational, but I don't think the psychedelic drug use necessarily helps. And that's one risk factor I sort of forgot to mention for HPPD, is taking it young when you're neurodevelopmentally sensitive. And so when I see, for instance, Rick Doblin, again, to Joe's point, the executive director of MAPS, seriously suggesting that he and his organization want to give MDMA to traumatized children as young as 7, I think we see the quite dystopian consequences of utopian thinking. And I think that Rick Doblin, or at least the whole utopian culture around psychedelics, that they've essentially, at least you could interpret it this way, have been deceived by the malicious end of a trickster.
I'd just like to pick up on maybe a slight point of tension in the dialogue so far. I think most of us are of the view that we want to resist having a single narrative from which to try and understand psychedelic experiences. But yeah, I sort of, everyone nodding their heads when you talked about the kind of the bad theology of the post-Lerian wave of thinking. And I was wondering if Joe or any of you might want to say something about where that balance between a flexibility of narratives, but also some constraints that might be placed on what a healthy or unhelpful narrative to understand psychedelic or interpret or integrate psychedelic experiences might be.
Well, I'm not sure I have a great direct answer to that. I mean, I think that what we're doing is probably, I mean, there's a sort of reductive sense of like literally just talking more honestly and more about it and sharing stories. I mean, I have my own proclivities and biases towards religion as shared symbol systems and shared meaning making systems. So it's easier for me to talk about this stuff in some cases with other Christians, because I can say things like that are shorthand for certain concepts that tie back to a tradition, that tie back to a shared authority. So I can say things like idolatry, and I don't have to give a disclaimer or explain it or worry that I'm going to upset somebody who thinks I'm saying one thing and I don't mean that. Or I can talk about grace, and they don't know what I mean by grace. Or I can talk about, these sort of like this sort of way. That's not to say everybody needs to be a Christian or anything like that, but I think at least being able to, I think being able to respect different narratives. I mean, I have a lot of problems, and I know a lot of other religious scholars who have a problem with the sort of perennial philosophy stuff that came, that was really prominent in the 60s and is still somewhat prominent today, where there's this sort of idea where there's a common, universal, similar experience at the core of all religions. People have people, and there, whatever grains of truth there might be in that, there's also a million reasons why that has poor implications that tend to try to simplify everything and simplify the narrative and make it a single shared unitive narrative around this certain type of mystical experience, which again, to tie into Tehseen's point, then becomes a self sort of replicating suggestibility thing. One problem with some research trials is this idea that it's a sort of intrinsic problem. I'm not saying there's necessarily a good solution around it, but there's this idea to try to create a secular container for a spiritual experience, as if the idea that secularity is neutral. Now, secularity might be the best thing we can do because we're a pluralistic society. Outside of psychedelics, everybody has multiple narratives. That's why we fight all the time. That's why there's all this stuff. Like we know that there are multiple ways to think about. There's a billion ways to think about life, and secularity is a sort of negotiated space that we kind of have to have. That seems like we've agreed upon in the West, at least. But that doesn't mean it's neutral, and that's a problem other much smarter religious scholars than me have articulated about the sort of like what has happened to society and thinking that this is what secular thought, which is related to scientific materialism and things like that. That's just the way it is. And so, then that presents the issues where universalism based on experience is seen as like, oh, well, that's the real, that's and based on a mystical experience that's also tied to materials, to a material causal agent like a psychedelic. I think it's tied into that similar bad theology that's gotten rebuffed and updated since the 60s, but I think still has its issues.
If I could add in, like, thanks for that, Joe. I would say directly to your attention, Sam, that it is an inflexible narrative to say that psychedelic experiences are always good or can always be made good. So that would be my response. There's a couple of things I wanted to sort of pick up on from before. Ed, you talked about psychedelics for kids. As far as I understand, I'm not entirely clear on the details, but I know that at least as I understand, the FDA is requesting this before approval of psychedelics, and it's for reasons of diversion. Like I think it happens with kind of new drugs in general. It's like, yeah, you would want it for a particular indication, but from a regulatory perspective, you might be concerned that it can sort of leak out of that. So you just want to test it with other groups. The relationship between that and Rick's rationale, like kind of which we may see as kind of massively overextending in a kind of cavalier way, some kind of proposition about kind of healing and trauma and so on. The relationship between those two things, I don't know. But it's interesting that, I think the regulators are going to require it, at least for, perhaps not for kids as young as 7, but for kids for sure. Yeah. And then if I may, just one last thing, it's coming back to something you said, Ed, about the ego dissolution thing. I have like a kind of a favorite story, or one of my favorite stories that someone told me, which will maybe kind of complement your LSD anecdote, your story, Ed, from when you were 20, which is a few years ago, a friend who runs a psychedelic integration group in the US, in Brooklyn. He told me about someone who came to their integration group, a man. And the man had talked about having like many psychedelic experiences, ayahuasca experiences. And as the trips got more and more intense for him, he kind of strove to kind of keep going until, like you were talking about, Ed, he was kind of near to breaking down. And then a voice in his head told him to stop, like it sort of appeared and told him to kind of stop. So he came along to the group to try to get some advice on what to do next. But he brought like a trickstery, I would say, knot with him. So on the one hand, he felt intuitively that he needed to give psychedelics a break and that he was having so many trips, it was kind of messing with him. And on the other hand, he could not stop wondering whether it was his ego telling him to stop because the ego didn't want to be killed in a so-called ego death. And so in fact, the voice was an indication of him making progress. And the way my friend told me the story, he said that during that meeting, a lot of people were trying to kind of slightly like maybe disabuse him of this conviction and be like, well, maybe you should just take a little break for now and sort of integrate what's been coming up so far and stuff. But no one could sort of shake him of this little riddle. And in the end, he left more assured than ever that what he needed to do was to kind of, break through and kill this voice. So that's a kind of maybe a nice example. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for the discussion so far. If there are some audience questions, I'd love to be able to put them to the panel if people drop them in the chat. Or if not, I'll ask another question.
And Sam, if I may, do come back on that. If you still think there's a tension there, it'd be nice to explore it a bit more.
I think I might have misinterpreted this. There seemed to be an agreement that, on the one hand, we didn't want to say that there were particular narratives that were sort of the right or wrong way of thinking about psychedelics, and yet there seemed to be some agreement that perhaps the kind of post-Lerian way of thinking about psychedelics was the wrong way. And I was wondering if within the plurality of narratives that we might want to allow people to explore, to integrate or understand psychedelic experiences, there should be maybe some guidelines within sort of the boundaries of acceptability, maybe, or the boundaries of healthy, and what those guidelines might be. If any of you would like to speak on that point, or maybe you completely disagree and think there shouldn't be any kind of prefixed guidelines of what a healthy integration approach should look like.
Well, since I brought it up, maybe I may have the first stab. Yes, I wouldn't want to, if someone genuinely is finding great benefit from using Timothy Leary's psychedelic experience based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, then they should go for it. And of course, I'm not going to suggest that it's intrinsically wrong, but I would have a bit of a back and forth and ask them perhaps to consider, I mean, lots of things with the book. I've gone slightly hazy on the details, but there are lots of ways in which Leary misinterpreted or bent the Tibetan Book of the Dead to fit his own narrative. It represented what a sort of instance of psychedelic culture's unfortunate tendency towards exoticism and Orientalism. And then thirdly, I would just I mean, I suppose at a certain point it comes down to a fundamental difference of theology. I suppose I'm quite post-Christian in my understanding, and so I would tend to agree with Joe probably. But I suppose at a certain point it reduces to what one's actual metaphysical point of view is, which obviously we'll disagree on. But fourth, I think it's just very interesting that so many people develop problems because of the Learian manual. Including, for example, John Lennon. John Lennon describes how he explicitly took psychedelics based on Leary's Book of the Dead. He based the song Tomorrow Never Knows based on this book, and he attempted to kill his ego. He says, I got the message and acid that I should kill my ego, and I did, is what he says. And he's essentially developed what seems like depersonalization, derealization. And I think there are lots of ways in which we're, at least nowadays, much more conscious of the possible harms and nuances of psychedelic drugs. I'm not sure how much I answered directly your question, but hopefully maybe Sam, Tehseen or Joe have any other thoughts on that?
My basic thought is, I think that this kind of speaks to the sort of risks of what risks we don't know, or the sort of all the vast unknowns that are out there. And one of them is around integration for me, which also I think often gets tied into sort of a victim blaming tendency that you see in psychedelics, where, well, you didn't integrate right. Well, you didn't do, you just, it's all about integration. That's all boils down to that. Well, in the West, there's not a sustained tradition of psychedelic integration. Not one that I know about, unless I'm making a massive blind spot. You have a lot of different ideas, you have a lot of different theories, you have a lot of what worked for me kind of stories, or even books out there that might even have tremendous value. And I think there is more trying to collect, like, okay, what's worked, what seems to work, and try to have better data around it. But we're still kind of guessing. And what might work for somebody or work for many people might completely not work for somebody else. I think I give a lot more deference and respect to indigenous cultures who have a sort of holistic way of integrating these. But I also have suspicion that we can just study them and figure it out. And this is the sort of colonization mindset that has been rife for a long time, of like, well, we can just extract what we need from this, or we can just take a couple of these different isolated practices, but we don't want to, we're not going to convert to their metaphysical view of the universe. And it's from a religious studies perspective, I have a tendency to think of, like, it's a lot harder to just extract and pick and choose things as individuals, which is often our tendency, especially if we are spiritual but not religious. And I was spiritual but not religious for a good decade. I was the author of my own spirituality, my own spiritual boss. But what that looks like is going to be very different from a sustained tradition around particular use, which may or may not have psychedelics as much of a focal point of their spirituality as we imagine it to be. And so I think there's a lot of unknowns around it.
For my part, I'd be happy to bring in some more voices if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi. Thanks for raising all these very important points. And yeah, I mean, definitely this headless going towards saying that psychedelics are just positive is well, we learned something from the 60s, 70s, I think, that nobody's really into Leary's ideas that much anymore. But I was just wondering if there isn't really a middle way. I mean, because we now really know the importance of the set and setting. We know the risks, but also all the benefits. Like, I mean, it really can give you a different perspective, and also like all the clinical trials, especially for depression. I mean, that's why it's a thought to work, because they can just be taken out of this negative ruminative loop and just see things from a different viewpoint. And even with challenging experiences, well, I think nobody's really saying that all the experiences are positive, but it's like you can learn something about yourself and about your kind of relationship to the world and other people from really difficult experiences as well. So I'm just wondering if it wouldn't, because everything we do is kind of like a weighing up of costs and benefits, right? And then if we put both of the things in, if we couldn't kind of tailor out a strategy to use these compounds smartly, and then kind of just try to channel them into a direction to get out as much benefit as we can. So what are your thoughts on that?
I can answer that. Well, at least I'll offer an answer first. I think that yes, that sort of medical approach of balancing risks and rewards and costs and benefits is most likely the right way to go. And yes, there obviously will be times when psychedelics might be worth it for people. I remember having a conversation with Henry Abraham, who was the guy behind the HPPD diagnosis, and he said he would be dismayed at anyone using hallucinogens based on his clinical experience, apart from people at the end of life, for example, but using end of life terminal cancer, death anxiety. So, well, yeah, at that point, the risk reward ratio seems fairly favorable if you won't be alive in the next 3 months. But I think that what I'd slightly at least add is that I don't think we entirely know the nature of the risks in this equation. I mean, for instance, I didn't know until last year that epileptic fits and seizures were a risk of psychedelic drugs. I had absolutely no idea. And then if you go on Reddit, which is a very interesting way to get sort of sentinel events of signals of what actually goes on in the naturalist population, you see dozens of stories of people having epileptic seizures under the influence of psychedelics. And now the first studies start to trickle out. I think if I read, there was a Johns Hopkins study which indicated it might affect as many as 2%, which seems not very high, but one in 50, certainly 1 in 50 higher than I thought it was. And then HPPD, speaking to people in the psychedelic community, it was striking to hear how many people had this experience, and within this medical model, it was okay, there's a risk, but it's extremely rare, and but maybe it's not extremely rare. Mortality as well, the idea that you can't overdose, but then why do I keep hearing stories then of people who have died under the influence of psychedelics? There's I'm not talking about physical overdose. I'm talking about deaths associated with psychedelics, which are not properly counted in the United States. So, for example, there's this nonprofit called the William G. Nash Foundation, which was founded by a woman called Kristen Nash, whose son died in an LSD psychosis. And part of her project is actually trying to create a federal counting system for psychedelic-associated deaths. And this relates to this idea of basically strawmans about myths associated with psychedelics. When you take psychedelics, you'll jump out a window, but that actually happens. I mean, it's such a thing in Fish culture, Fish being this band, or in the Grateful Dead culture, there were jumpers. People regularly jump from heights. And this isn't necessarily in this medical model, but it points that there are real risks that are dismissed. And then fourthly, this is something I've been writing and thinking about a lot in the last few days, is psychedelic dependency and addiction, which has been dismissed entirely as a possibility. I found dozens of media reports and papers saying that to blanket psychedelics are not addictive. But then if you actually look at the data around what's known as hallucinogen use disorder, you'll find that it might affect as many as 10% of people in broad surveys of the American population. And in adolescents, that percentage seems to increase. And then reflecting my own experience, I was definitely dependent on hallucinogens when I was at university. And I don't mean physical dependence, I mean psychologically addicted to the psychedelic high. Of course, people can be addicted to gambling, people can be addicted to gaming. So what planet would psychedelics not be addictive? And I think that with long-term follow-ups, especially because I think over the long term, these risks might start to unfold. People who've relieved their depression through psychedelics, but then it might come back. And that's when a psychedelic psychological dependence, for instance, might start to emerge. So there are all sorts of and just finish off quickly, we don't know, for instance, of the specific risks of high doses of particular drugs. I mean, there was a really interesting study on rodents, again, all qualifications around rodents, but they administered chronically high doses of LSD frequently among these rodents, and they developed strange, aberrant behavior that never stopped. And so the authors of this study essentially were wondering whether you could induce whether the phenomenon of persistent psychosis might actually be a thing if you take enough psychedelics, because they activated genes associated with psychosis, with schizophrenia, psychotic spectrum disorders, and all qualifications applied. And Tehseen has a certain expertise, more than me, in the problems with genetics research. But it's interesting, and we don't know what the possible effects might be of chronic high dose LSD, for instance. We just don't know. So yeah, that's some thoughts.
And if I could just tag on that, and thank you for your question, Rebecca. I mean, I kind of I kind of guess in the longest of timelines, right? Like if we think about a century from now, what are people going to be thinking about psychedelics, and think about how little we know now, just how little data we have now. Like I kind of feel like we'll probably have a better idea in a Western kind of perspective of this. Maybe it won't take that long, but I guess my biggest problem is this. I wish people accepted that this is a frontier, that this is just an unknown. And we humans have a natural exploring frontier impulse. That's not a bad thing, to figure out what's the unknown. But and I've written before, it's like it's unethical to tell people, well, this is to say, oh, let's come on the Oregon Trail, but nobody dies on the Oregon Trail, or hardly. And if they died, it's their fault, or they weren't prepared right, or a lot of people died on the Oregon Trail, and they might have wished they had known a little bit more what was happening. And there still is. I'm not saying there's no value to figuring out what might be the sort of right middle way and the longest of timelines. But I think we just. I would want anybody to be going in with completely open eyes and open dialogue. And a lot of the incentive structures right now, both socially and in the professional world and the capitalistic incentives, incentivize a dishonest dialogue. And we just see, from my view, it can be infuriating seeing oversimplified information being repeated over and over, and by people who know better too, I should say. Like the people repeating oversimplified narratives, they do know better. And I don't understand, I don't completely understand why it's still like that.
Just to follow on, one of the things, I'm not sure that we're in such a post-Leary era, not only because of, like, for example, talking about the kind of ego dissolution stuff. But so one thing that I take from some of Leary's writings is this idea of the trip as being very programmable. It's 99% set and setting, this kind of idea. And that comes very nicely back to the suggestion, the idea that suggestibility is kind of rising again as a kind of research area. So I think, like anything, like any person who's written a lot or had a lot of influence, it's like, well, maybe in some ways we're a post, in other ways we're not. So I wouldn't be so blanket in sort of talking about kind of us being post-Leary. But in terms of the middle way, I mean, I'm totally into that. And like, when someone tells me that they're going to be taking psychedelics, I'm like, wow, that's really exciting. If you want to share, let's talk about that. I want to hear how you're going into it, and if I can help in any way, and just as a friend or whatever. So I'm super into it. I in a way, I think from where I come from, with that background kind of around kind of critical psychiatry and the psychiatric survivor movement, in a way I feel like the medical system incentivizes ways of being that around possible medical treatments, currently around psychedelics, as we've been partially speaking about, that isn't very middle way, so then we have a bit of a dilemma when we have a conversation like this. Like, are we going to be trying to talk about pros and cons and really be balanced, or are we actually trying to counteract to some extent the kind of prominent discourses? I'm all for the middle way. But if you have that kind of middle way, and you have an approach that's like lots of challenging experiences one can learn from and so on, then I would only say, like, beware the psychedelic exceptionalism, surely in relation to all drugs, I reckon, all drug experiences pretty much. And also in relation to all kinds of extreme experiences not occasioned by drugs, right? So there's that population that one might want to draw about or try to draw a boundary around of people who are have psychotic disorders, if you could even do that, is massively heterogeneous, and includes people who, as I mentioned in relation to my PhD with the Hearing Voices movement, people who don't think they really have a problem, who feel like they've been misdiagnosed and so on, who feel like it's a gift, their experiences, their extreme experiences, not caused by psychedelics. So I feel like all of that has to be pulled in if one wants to be genuinely kind of, as I understand it, middle way. So that would be, yeah.
No, definitely. Thanks. But that's, I mean, maybe going back to Ed's point a little bit about epilepsy and schizophrenia. Yeah, of course. I mean, we know that even in trials, you exclude people if they have a family history of schizophrenia, and probably, I mean, it has anything to do with epilepsy. It's kind of like you need to know your medical background, your familial history, and kind of, yeah, the risks that it could interfere. So it's always a thing. But also with this, like, I don't know, people dying or jumping out of the windows, it's like the more people try it, that like there are people that would do such things in just any situation. Well, a lot of people are prone to kind of just using a lot of compounds at the same time, and just like they're already, I don't know, drunk and like tried other things, and just psychedelics might just be another thing on the mix. So it's like when such cases are reported, often it's not really like, it's not reported as a multi-drug or like and problem, like a holistic problem. Is kind of like, oh, there was a psychedelic in the mix, then that's the cause, right? So it's a bit more complicated, but I mean, if it's a controlled setting, if the people are well informed and they have, I don't know, guides and well, just a safe space to develop and kind of be a hand to hold on to if they need it. So far, there were very few reports of any dangers in like controlled situations. So,
well,
yeah,
this is where we might want to come back to the sort of stories of abuses within institutional contexts and within overground contexts. It doesn't necessarily mean that abuses won't happen. If anything, it means it's more difficult to kind of complain against them, because what you're met with is like, well, standard operating procedures and confidentiality agreements and so on. So abuses don't stop when, you know, institutional procedures are put in place, and that's part of a much more complex story of what gets called the iatrogenic harms of the medical system itself. But personally, my ethos in relation to recreational or non-institutionalized, non-medical use is, it comes from, like, I find very powerful this line from the maxim from the peer support movement of having the dignity to make your own mistakes. You know, like, okay, like, let someone, you know, if someone wants to do something, you know, give them that dignity of like, yeah, they might be wrong, let them be wrong, you know, even if you think they're wrong, kind of thing. But it's within the institutional settings that the statutory or other forms of coercion can kind of be normalized. And that's, I think, maybe where we've got to really keep our eye on the ball, is what I would say.
And I would also add on to that, to bring back this suggestibility thing, which really it has a lot of unsettling implications. And the institutionalization of suggestibility means that institutional ideologies, which institutions are prone to protect and develop and pass on, that's why institutions basically exist. And now you're being given high suggestibility drugs under their particular paradigm, whether it's certain theological paradigms, certain psychological paradigms. And so how do you place a risk factor on you coming out with a totally different theological system than maybe you would have signed up for going in? I think of James Kent too, in talking about as an advocate for the recreational setting for kind of this reason, which is that also in the recreational setting, he's like, you're probably less inclined to take what happens in a super serious way. Like in the party culture, rave scene, there's a kind of intrinsic, well, we're just on drugs and the things that happen might be fun or entertaining or interesting. But often in these institutionalized settings, whether it's through therapy or religious or quasi-institutional kind of ayahuasca circles type thing, suddenly you have an increased suggestibility, and you're being surrounded by so many subtle theologies and psychologies that there's really no risk-free play. There are certain settings that mitigate certain risks, but are pretty vulnerable to other risks.
But in some ways, I think institutions could also be controlled, or just have inspectors from, I don't know, the more people are involved to see if the like trials are being carried out normally, then that could work. And also, I mean, most of those people dedicate their lives to this. This is their job, right? And it's also super hard to work with psychedelics. It's super hard to like come up with a study that well, because of their Schedule 1 status as well. So it's like people who do work with these are, I mean, it would make sense for them to be super careful about what happens there, because otherwise it might end up very badly for their job, for their lives, for their careers. And yeah, I mean, unless it's kind of like really a huge project of all of them being involved to just manipulate the participants, which, I mean, the more people needed, I think the more difficult it is to coordinate. And yeah, I find it quite hard to go into such a mysterious project, but yeah, maybe.
And I'm not talking, and I'm in that sense, I'm not talking about some kind of conscious conspiracy to advance or mass manipulate people. I don't think it really works like that. I don't think it's worked like that in non-psychedelic settings with that. But I think also, as Tehseen points out, unfortunately, once you try to push back on an institution, you start experiencing firsthand just how hard it is, and just the sort of, in theory, right, people would be more concerned and more vigilant and more concerned about whistleblowing and that kind of thing. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it really, really doesn't work. And sometimes it kind of has the opposite effect. But anyway, that's that.
I'd also add that we need to distinguish between current clinical trials and the therapies to which they'll eventually be translated, especially, you know, in 5 years' time, when psychedelics might be legal, sold throughout the United States, maybe in the UK, when they're likely to be fairly expensive. Is Oregon $12,000 for psilocybin therapy? And so we're going to see, and there already is a fairly sizable underground therapy sector, and that's where the real lack of protection happens. That's when you start to have, and I think that you're going to see some real messianic would-be DIY shamans in this underground space. And also, I would say that the current clinical trial settings, as Joe says, I don't fundamentally trust what is reported. I was contacted recently by a lady who participated in a clinical trial in Canada with psilocybin, who has since developed full-blown HPPD. She developed HPPD symptoms after the 3rd dose. And because she was convinced that therapeutic settings were basically risk-free, she then tripped again after the trial and then developed it full-blown HPPD. And that was with a therapist in an underground setting. And the MAPS trials also indicated that there were, I think it was at least 3 incidents, or 1 of sexual abuse and then 2 of major psychological deteriorations after therapy that were just not reported. And I would not be surprised if there were other instances of serious adverse events or relapses in depression beyond the current follow-up lengths of the current studies that are just not reported. Yeah.
Well, none of that is none of that is particular to psychedelics, right? It's kind of like, yeah, of course, if you're gonna, I mean, what's required, I think, is a sort of structural analysis. Like, you can talk about individuals' intentions or motivations, and that's kind of fine. But if you look at kind of a structural analysis, the incentives for organizations, for institutions, and so on, are structured in a way, like, why do you think people are doing clinical trials? They're doing it to get drugs approved. But this is it keys into a long history. David Healy has written a lot, and others, about kind of, for example, the coding of suicidal ideation in the research on SSRIs as emotional lability, recoding it as something else it's not just what you measure, it's what you call it, it's what you then report, it's all the specifics of clinical trial research. And through that process, there seemed to be, in looking, retrospectively, a lot of care, let's call it, taken in the presentation of evidence and the building of cases of evidence in relation to SSRIs, in a way that hid the suicidal kind of ideation for a long time, and it took a long time before the black box warnings kind of came out in relation to that. So this isn't particular to kind of psychedelics.
But that's, I mean, it was tested on populations that were at risk of developing suicidal ideations anyways, right? I mean, with SSRI.
You mean like for example, depression or treatment-resistant depression? Yeah, that resonates with the psychedelic sector, right?
Unfortunately, we've reached our allotted time limit. This has been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure we could keep going. If we were all together in a room, I'd invite the audience to give a big round of applause. So if people would like to, please, turn your microphones on and say thank you to our fantastic speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for everyone.
Thank you all for coming. Fantastic.
Yeah, cheers, Sam.
Thank you.